welcome Colleen M. Delaney, who spent her childhood interest in history, stories, and special places as she frequently moved throughout the United States. She's currently a professor at CSU Channel Islands and uses history, oral history, archaeology, and anthropology to tell the stories of the past and present along California's central coast. Rancho Guadalasca, the last ranch of California's central coast, is a wonderful piece about a forgotten land, and I've actually confessed to mountain biking on Point Magoo Trail, and you get the sense that something was there amongst these trails, and it just wasn't people on the trails. You just get this feeling, this essence, and I'm so glad you wrote this book. So please welcome Colleen M. Delaney.
Thank you. Thank you for coming. So I'm going to briefly talk about 5,000 years of history in 10 to 15 minutes, but hopefully that will entice you guys all to read the book and or come to the exhibit that will be at Cal State Channel Islands based on this in the fall. So yes, I'm a archaeologist. My training actually was working with Chumash era sites, and I worked with the Ventureño Chumash at Cal State Channel Islands. And after the Springs fire, the students and I were surveying the hillsides on campus, and there was a strange stone structure, and I didn't match the university, didn't seem to belong to the state mental hospital, which was on the grounds before the university. And so I hoped it was earlier folks who owned the property, and that started this journey and the many, many rabbit holes that I went through this, talk about this. So I say Rancho Guadalasca is the last ranch of the Central Coast, last meaning southernmost, right? Ventura County used to be a part of Santa Barbara County, and so that's it. So this was the 1861 map that was produced once her land grant owned by Isabel Yorba was approved by the United States government. So if you're familiar with Ventura County, it's basically Point Magoo, the lagoon and Sycamore Canyon up to Dos Vientos neighborhood of Newberry Park, and then down right to Lewis Road, and then again back down to Magoo Lagoon. So it's this quadrangle, about 30,000 acres. And the original grantee, she preferred to call it actually La Laguna because of the freshwater ponds, which were on the main parcel of the property where the university is today. So this is why it was so valuable. We're not quite sure what Guadalasca means. Some folks believe it's a Hispanization and a combination of Guada, right? So Wadi, right, from the Moorish and from Spain. But also Alaska potentially means sycamore in Chumash, in Ventureño Chumash, which Sycamore Canyon, right, is the southernmost boundary of the property, so that may count for that. So this is it. So a very brief history. The Chumash have been there since time immemorial. Archaeologists will say they've been in this area for 15 to 20,000 years. They were removed from the land in the early 1800s, and Isabel Yorba from Santa Barbara petitioned for the grant in 1836. And so from 1836 up until 1870, she owned the property. Sorry, 1871. And from then until about 1900, it was mostly ranching. And starting about the 1890s, it shifted more to farming. And then, starting about 1930, things start getting subdivided. So I'll talk about that. But that's the very brief history there. And I should say, State Mental Hospital closed in 1997, and then the university opened in 2002. But I don't want this to be a straight timeline. So my point of writing the book was highlighting the individuals, right, the peoples and the activities that occurred there that a lot of people are unaware of, right? So celebrating the Chumash, for example, as I indicated, they've been here. I think the oldest site we have on the Guadalasca dates to at least 7,000, 8,000 years ago. It was a very important part of Chumash territory. The Chumash were independent villages, but you did have some collaboration and folks working together, and confederacies, possibly Lulapin was the confederacy between some of the islanders and the mainlanders, and that was headquartered, so to speak, at Muwu, which is Magoo. That name comes from. So while many folks think of Santa Barbara and the islands as the center for the Chumash world, I'm pushing the Ventureño Chumash as Muwu controlled the religious calendar from all the way up, from that area all the way up here. And so they were movers and shakers in their own right, even though they weren't quite as large as villages up here. And I like to point out the oldest evidence of the tomo, the Chumash plank canoe, comes from Somomo, which is a village that was on the Guadalasca as well. So it's a very important historic portion of the county. The Chumash, of course, were removed to the missions, and or some also stayed out working on ranches. But we do have evidence of the Chumash living on the area. So, for example, Cecilio Tumamite and his wife Mary, they lived and worked on the Lewis Ranch for a period of time. At least one of their daughters was born there at the, sorry, did I say Lewis? Broom Ranch. So it gets subdivided between folks. And the Chumash are still there today. For many people who might be not aware of that, I proudly work with them at Cal State Channel Islands. We're working to protect their sacred mountain, Sawiwa, which is on the campus, right? And we just created a campus cultural resource management team and archaeology team where we work together with them to protect the resources on campus. So that's the Chumash. And then we move on to a great variety of people. One of my favorite is Isabel Yorba. We have no pictures of her. She was illiterate, right, as was common at the time. This is her adobe, which was in De La Guerra Plaza. They tore it down after it was damaged in the 1925 earthquake, and it's now the parking lot for City Hall. But she must have been an amazing woman, born in 1789. Her father came as, he was one of the De Fagas Catalan volunteers, and her mother was a Gravalia, right, very old family, came with Cortez. And her mother, as an 8-year-old, walked down the Conejo Grade, which I just find amazing, on the De Anza expedition, and saw the land that her daughter would later own, right? That just gives me chills to think about.
Wow.
So she's married at 15 and a half, as is common at the time, and by the time she's 17, or the day after she turned 17, her daughter was born, and they moved to Santa Barbara, where her husband, a soldier, was transferred to the Presidio, and she spent the rest of her life here in Santa Barbara. But she only had one daughter who unfortunately died in 1818 at the age of 11, but she took her societal roles seriously. She gave the first fruits to the priests, and she took care of her godchildren and the children of her godchildren. So at various times she had up to 8 or 10 people in her household that she took care of. And so 2 of her adopted daughters actually also married foremen, mayordomos of her ranch. And while many folks struggled during the time, she actually managed, as an illiterate woman, to hold on to the ranch. So even in 1861, when we had the atmospheric river that washed the adobes away, many of them, as the quote here by the De La Guerras in Santa Barbara is that Santa Barbara was a city of paper, because all the adobes were melting from a month of nonstop rain. She was down to her molars, which is a saying at the time, so apparently she lost everything. Her adobe was damaged, and her workers out of La Laguna, where the campus is today, barely made it out with their lives because the arroyo, flooded its banks in the middle of the night. But she held on to it. She fought the federal government for them to recognize her ranch, which finally happened in 1857. But it wasn't actually patented by President Grant until after she died. But she held on to it until 1868. She subdivides it, sells us one parcel to her nephew for $1, and then the southern parcel she sells to a series of businessmen, including Hollister and Thomas Dickerson, who actually was in San Luis Obispo and Arroyo Grande. So, and he and his brother and another person bought it. Went to a whole series of people, including I think Albert Dinsmore, who lived in Montecito, was killed by his horse, got hit in the head. Kicked in the head with his horse. But eventually, it was sold to William Richard Broom and his wife Frances. And the Brooms still control portions of the ranch today. They're very proud of that. They've been the landowners since 1880, but they've lost portions since then due subdivisions, but also because the military encouraged them to sell. So all the area around Magoo Lagoon, that is now a Naval Air Station, Point Magoo, is also now called Naval Base, Ventura County, and Point Magoo State Park. That was also their property, and they were also encouraged to sell, right? So they were not happy about that, but that's what happens, right, this time. So lots of ties between Santa Barbara, right, and the area. But there's also some people that are less known. We had a series of Jewish businessmen, right? So it's a very small population historically in Ventura County, but they bought the parcel from the nephew, because the nephew owed them one of them $5,000, But actually, unlike other Americans, Wolf Kalischer, who was a proponent of indigenous rights, he helped send one of the Pala Indian Native Americans to Washington, D.C. to petition for their reservation. So he gave Jesus de Yorba, Juan de Jesus, and his wife time to try to find a buyer. And he said, for $3,000, if you can find a buyer within this time period, you will pay you this money. Don't know if they were unable to, or they decided to keep it because Kalischer and his partner Wartenberg founded the first commercial tannery in Los Angeles. And Wartenberg, his partner, also founded the first fire department because their business burned, right, in the late 1860s. Wartenberg dies suddenly, so I think it's caught up in probate, and it's then sold to Louis Sloss and Louis Gersel, two famous Jewish businessmen from San Francisco. You should read about them. There's another amazing history. And they hold on to it. It seems like it's more just a business investment, but because you only hear word from them. For example, the Sloss family in particular and their in-laws, the Lilienthals, were frequent visitors to Santa Barbara. So they come down there. They both died coincidentally in 1902, and the wives hold on to it for another couple years, and then they sell it to a Jewish businessman from Wainini for 1 week, and that gets sold to the Lewis family. That's another family there. So lots of interesting people that we don't really think about much have been in the area. And that's kind of it for the landowners that I'll talk about. But I'm going to talk about the amazing people that were there. And bring a picture. I did not. Chung Wang was an early Chinese immigrant to Santa Barbara. He's here, I think, by at least the 1870s. He marries a woman named Minnie. She's from San Francisco, who was rescued from a brothel when she was young. But he was a well-known figure here. He had a vegetable peddler. He had a curio shop. But the Santa Barbara newspapers, they talk about yet another calamity befell him. Poor guy. He must have had a series of misadventures. But this one was talking about his wagon went wild. His horse went wild in downtown, causing damage to others. But that's maybe how he got to know the Brooms, because in 1899-ish, he and his family moved to Ventura County so he can be foreman of the Broom Ranch. And even though they only lived there for about 2 years, that made a significant impact on their daughter, Margaret. She was the oldest. There's a huge span in age between the children because her mother had tuberculosis. And so she had to care for her mother a lot. Her father was ill, so as a 10-year-old, she learned how to hook up the horses to the wagon to haul freight for the railroad. But she became the first female Chinese-American physician. She has an amazing history. And she became mom to the fair-haired bastards. So she met this group of unemployed pilots in the early 1930s. They wanted to go fight for China when Japan invaded, and she had created a group of men, first aviators, who became her sons. Read the book and you'll find out where the name Fair-Haired Bastards comes from. But she had a group of over 1,000 men that she, quote, took care of. When they were injured during World War II, they would come and recuperate at her house. Admiral Nimitz had to clean up after dinner at her house because she would have these big parties, but the rule was that even the the bigwigs had to do chores. So amazing history, because even though she was only on the Guadalasca for 2 years, she still talked about the group of men. She would go hunting with them and camping with them, so it really made a big difference. So that's an example of the diversity we have on the ranch. And then we have, many people are unaware, the Japanese-run sport fishing camp at Magoo Lagoon. So originally they tried to start a steamship line there, Goodall and Nelson, who stopped here. And it didn't happen because then the piers were built. Maybe they couldn't get landowner permission, right, to get access to the pier. But Frank Kubota ended up running the sport fishing camp for over 20 years, and it was very egalitarian. So you had the president or vice president of MGM Studios and Lionel Barrymore, right, actor and artist, rubbing elbows with just waitresses and painters. And so this is their bait boat, the Starlight. He sold in 1936 and went back to Japan, so we don't know what happened to him because of the war. But again, egalitarian. Most of these fishermen here were actually from the Azores. So lots of Japanese and Portuguese. And Azorean, I don't know what you'd say for that. Folks out there. And really interesting story, then in 1939, the unnamed storm of 1939. Basically what we had last fall. It was a hurricane off the coast. Actually, it was a hurricane for 1 minute, but 24 of the 48 people who died in the storm out on boats came out of one boat out of Magoo, right, the spray. So that was very sad.
Oh.
Yeah. Yeah. And then there's good and bad, right? There's racism, right, that also occurs out there. This gets a little complicated, but Isabel Yorba's foreman's son, the foreman's son, kills her son-in-law on the ranch in 1868. It's a very complicated story, lots of, back and forth. Basically it comes down to not giving them notice. But anyways, he was killed. And this is his daughter, right, who died. And so we don't have any pictures of Isabel or Francisco Javier Bonilla, who was the son who did the killing, but we have the picture of the children left behind for Abadie. I don't speak French. Abadie. I don't know how to pronounce his name. But it's an interesting story because, it highlights this poor kid. He's 18 years old. He claims they both had guns and they both, fired. Abadie is killed. He runs for the hills. He's up in the mountains for a month, and his father convinces him to come back to Santa Barbara because they all assumed it was self-defense, right? Of course. 22 Californias on the jury pool. None of them make it onto the jury. So there's 11 Anglo-Americans and 1 Spaniard on the jury. And I've read the court testimony. Could everybody understand what was said? Because about 60 to 70% of it was in Spanish, right? He's sentenced to death, sentenced to hang. Everybody wrote letters. Pablo de la Guerra, who was the judge, the Mexican consul, over 200 citizens of Santa Barbara wrote letters to say, please don't kill this, don't execute this poor kid. He was given life in prison. It was commuted to life in prison, and he fought for 20 years, and he was pardoned in 1888, right? Wow. 19 years in prison. Wow. And we don't know much about his family, and this is another thing I talk about, racism and people not being treated equally. We know the name of his father and his brother, but what is the name of his sister, right? There's the unnamed sister who they talked about as part of the case. Don't know what happened to her, but apparently they disparaged her. There was one of the De La Guerra saying this is wrong, that they're saying all these nasty things about this poor innocent girl, right? So this girl on the ranch. But some of you guys may be familiar with her. This is Felicia Dodd. So she was, I'm trying to think of the age. She was about 4 years old when her father was killed. She married Alexander Harmer. She was considered one of the biggest beauties of California. And in 1890, she marries Alexander Harmer, who founded the Santa Barbara style of art. And her Adobe, Isabel's, became their art studio, right, at the time. So that's her. And then other diversity. We have Basque sheep ranchers and farmers, including Pierre and John Agora, as in Agora Hills. They leased the land, some of the land first. I just found out another Basque person was on the Broom Ranch, but I can't pronounce his last name, so I'm not going to tell it to you. But we have those there. We have Japanese sugar beet laborers, but also farmers. So, for example, 2 sugar beet farmers leased land at Satwiwa, at Round Mountain. So I like to point that out because so often they talk about the sugar beet laborers, they don't actually realize that actually there were some folks who actually were working on their own accord there. We had black chuck wagon cooks, right, on the Lewis Ranch, for example. There was a failed evangelical city where Dos Vientos is today, which is quite hilarious.
Really?
Learn about that one. And then the Lewises who used Percheron horses because they did better in the soils of the Oxnard Plain, they actually owned part of the property for only 5 years, but within the 3rd year they had national champion Percherons that they were breeding on what was the Lewis Ranch, right, on Guadalasca. So, and then H.W. Roll, who was a German contractor, or he's originally from Lübeck, Germany, which is near and dear to my heart because I work there. But he built the breakwater at Wainini, and he was brought up on possible charges. They had hearings in Washington, D.C. because they thought maybe he was a double agent because the project they were supposed to be working on at Pearl Harbor didn't get finished in time before it was attacked. So there were some questions about whether or not he did that intentionally, but he was cleared. So the area is known, right? So it was ranching up until late 1890s, and starting in 1890 in particular, sugar beets came to the fore, right, because of all the alkali soils. And then also lima beans. So the Lewis family is famous for lima beans. His father, Lewis, was born in Carpinteria, and with his father, they have the Lewis lima, right, up there. And then he came to Ventura County, and at one point, Ventura County produced 75% of the world's lima beans, right? That was up until the 1920s. The Lewis family loses the ranch in 1931 at the start of the Great Depression, which is why the the state bought it for first the state mental hospital, and then it became the university. And the state mental hospital, if you guys aren't aware, right, it was until 1997, but it was a city in all of itself. I just love this. The largest wastewater treatment plant west of the Mississippi, right? They had everything, and I love the example of in 1946, there were 4,000, over almost 5,000 patients there. And that year they served in the cafeteria 4,955,000 meals in 1 year. So, and then today, great variety of things on the Guadalasca, Point Mugu State Park, right, Dos Vientos neighborhood, Cal State Channel Islands, the Conejo Mountain Cemetery, which the landowner of that one loved it so much that she turned it into a cemetery so she could be buried there, right? And then I love this shot. This is from the Navy, right? So we have Mugu Lagoon in the background with the Navy base, and this is Laguna Peak, which is still on the is on the Broome property, but they've leased that to them, right, for access to this. So there we go.
Wow.
5,000 years of history in a very short amount of time.
Wow, bravo!
But lots, and there's still even more to talk about. But hopefully, you guys enjoy this little bit of history of the South Coast.
Colleen, how were you able to put all this research together and tie it into a comprehensive, yet very readable piece of work?
How? I don't know if you guys could read it and tell me if I was able to do that.
Okay.
I think so. It's hard because there is so many threads, but yes, I went through some stuff by time, and then I pulled out themes. So there's a diversity chapter. There's a chapter on the State Mental Hospital. And some of the early part, it was kind of more linear, but then I wanted to bring it back to say the diversity question, for example.
There were a lot of potential rabbit holes that you could have fallen down, yet
there are lots of rabbit holes.
you kind of pulled back to be able to tell this story, and I'm just wondering where you found most of your research and
Right, so most of the research was nowadays it's great, they have the online databases with the mission records, so I can see that Isabel, for example, stood up as for weddings, including Dana, Hartnell, to one of the Carrillo daughters. So the online Ancestry.com, for example, newspapers.com. But I also visited the Santa Barbara Missions, the Santa Barbara Historical Museum, the Museum of Ventura County. I went up to the Bancroft and the State Railroad Museum, the State Archives, a little bit of everywhere to piece this.
And obviously you went to a lot of the sites and places to go. And what were the things that impressed you when you're doing the physical research part, or made the most impression on you?
Well, that's hard to say because I'm an archaeologist, but I mean, this whole thing really started is I used to work at Cal State Fullerton, and I used to drive across the Oxnard Plain to PCH to get down because I hate the 101. And I would literally see Rancho Guadalasca. So if you drive down the 101, Conejo Mountain, all the way across to the ocean, that is the Guadalasca. And so when I actually started at Moorpark College, after that I got permission from the Brooms to do a survey on their property, where we found a site that's about 1,500 years old there, and that's what started me on the Guadalasca. So for me, and I can see it from my bedroom window, right? So for me, it's so I love going hiking up there, up in the state park. If you guys haven't been up there, Rancho Potrero and Point Mugu State Park. It's just a wonderful place, and a lot of people have never heard of it because it's managed to stay more rural compared to other places, right? Where Santa Barbara and other places, but it's still for the most part very rural. So
the Brooms gave you permission, but did they have personal interest in what you were doing, or did they?
Yes, and they were wonderful. They gave me permission for example, Mr. Broom let me come to his house and scan photographs, as did the Lewis family. I managed to find the great-grandson of Joseph Lewis because Ancestry.com, I kept seeing this one person posting stuff, and so I dropped them an email, and voila. And they're going to loan me the coffee pot from the chuck wagon for the exhibit.
That's great. And when is the exhibit?
It'll be August 23rd to December 15th.
At the university?
At the university here. And the opening is September 14th.
Great. Did anybody have questions?
Did you say you there's something coming up at the Presidio also here locally?
Yes. So we just arranged it this week, but I think the date is August 23rd. I will be giving a talk with the Santa Barbara Trust for
Great.
Preservation.
All right.
Yeah, so that will be a longer talk.
Yeah,
More than my machine gun 15 minutes.
that's great. Any other questions right now?
I want to know how many things you had to edit yourself because of the plethora of information that you saw and were interested in.
Yeah, it was hard.
Which is kind of like how are you focusing this down? Or there's some stories that are like, maybe I'll come back
Yeah.
for this.
Well, some stories I'm gonna have to, I'm just finding out people, but some of the stories may be a little long because I just love the stories so much, such as Margaret Chung, who only lived on the ranch for 2 years, but she had such an amazing story. I mean, she specialized in psychiatry, plastic surgery, and there was a third one because as a woman, she couldn't get appointments, right? She couldn't get postdocs and stuff. Oh, and so she took jobs that she could, so she gained all these experiences. So there's a few little rabbit holes like that.
Margaret was Minnie's daughter.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah, Minnie and Wang. So it's interesting. He goes by Chung Wang because in Chinese society usually the last name is first, but his daughter then is Americanized, so she went by Margaret Chung. Right. So the family name is Chung.
I really like how you connected the diversity of different groups. I mean, Oxnard, Ventura, that whole area. I mean, you know, with the strawberry farmers, the Japanese strawberry farmers, they united with the Mexican farm to form a union.
Right. They had the first successful agricultural strike. It was the sugar beet farmers.
Okay.
And the Mexican workers were invited into the National Farm Workers Union, but they refused to accept the Japanese workers, and so the Mexican workers said, nope, we're not joining, right, if you're not going to let them in as well.
Wow.
A lot of people don't know about that.
Interesting. Very interesting. Are there any other questions? So in conclusion, this project, well, I should ask you how it started into such an extensive project before I ask about the conclusion.
Right, well, it was trying to find that weird structure, right? It was like, who owned it? It didn't match the hospital. So I kept delving and trying to find out the people. And the irony is it probably dates to the 1950s. It looks like it was an unofficial quarry. So I think it was a structure related to a quarry. So it was a work building. Because of the aerial photographs, you can't quite see the structure, but it looks like it because it's too hazy, but you can see the quarry that it was built in by 1958. And most of the artifacts date to the 40s and the 50s. So it seems like, that's so funny. It ended up being a recent building, but that's what put me down the trail to this.
How long did this journey take you?
Well, I started with the Shumash stuff back in 2004, and others here helped me with some of the field work. And then I got really the push. I've been doing this various talks, but I wanted to get the book ready in time for the 150th anniversary of the founding of Ventura County, right?
Okay.
Which is this year. It's July 1st.
Great.
And so that gave me the extra push that I had to get this done.
So you were under the gun, so to speak, to get this done. And now that it's finished, just your general feelings about the work you put in, and how do you feel about putting together something like this?
Yeah, it's always weird, right? Because on the one hand, there's still stories that I want to tell that I didn't get in there. It's like, okay, that's for next. But also it's amazing because for me, it's again wanting people to know about the special place that is today Ventura County and all the hidden voices, the people such as the unnamed sister, right? That you don't know about. And so it's just letting people be aware of the diversity of folks that we've had there and all the amazing activities and experiences.
Wow. Well, congratulations. It's a wonderful project. And thank you, Colleen and Delaney, for joining us. Thank you.
Thank you.